Ocean iron fertilization. Have scientists found a way to eliminate the CO2 emitted by the ocean into the atmosphere? A presentation by Vignesh Sankar, Kevin Maclary, and Jon Kerby. In theory, ocean iron fertilization takes a natural process and enhances it through a geoengineered system. It is defined as intentional introduction of iron to the upper layers of the ocean. Why would we do that, you ask? Well, iron plays a huge role in the blooming of phytoplankton beds. Phytoplankton is the cornerstone of biological productivity in a marine ecosystem and is the key to the aquatic food chain. These phytoplankton populations also help combat the emission of CO2 into the Earth's atmosphere. But Vig, how does the introduction of iron stop CO2 emissions from the oceans? Good question. In order for phytoplankton to thrive, they require iron, an essential nutrient. But iron is pretty insoluble in seawater, and therefore, natural phytoplankton development is pretty limited. What people don't know is that phytoplankton has silica carbonate skeletons, and are responsible for most of the carbon sequestration in our oceans. For those who don't know what sequestration means, it means elimination. When these organisms die, their bodies float down to the bottom of the ocean for eons to come, along with all that CO2 which would normally be discharged into the atmosphere.
The science behind iron fertilization is surprisingly simple. Scientist John Martin noticed something interesting about the parts of the ocean that did not grow much phytoplankton, even though it seems they had everything they needed. He realized that these waters were iron deficient. This is a problem because phytoplankton need iron as a micronutrient. Iron acts as an electron carrier and a catalyst during photosynthesis, the process by which plankton gain nutrients. The phytoplankton need a certain ratio of CO2, oxygen, nitrogen, and iron to undergo photosynthesis. Therefore, when there is not enough iron, it acts as a limiting reactant, and the plankton grows slowly, if at all. If more iron is added, it can undergo photosynthesis. Iron no longer acts as a limiting reactant, and the phytoplankton can grow until they run out of another essential nutrient. The reason we want more phytoplankton is because they go through the process of photosynthesis, as explained earlier. Photosynthesis is important because it extracts CO2 from the air. This happens because plants, like phytoplankton, take in CO2, water, and light and turns it into sugar and oxygen by the following equation. 6CO2 plus 6H2O plus light energy reacts to yield C6H12O6 plus 6O2. This light reaction happens in the thiocloid membrane and converts light energy into chemical energy. The energy harvested via the light reaction is stored by forming a chemical called ATP. The next step is a dark reaction involving a process called the Calvin cycle, in which CO2 and energy from ATP are used to form sugar. Once the phytoplankton obtains the CO2 from the atmosphere or ocean, it has to go somewhere, and there are two options. If another creature eats the phytoplankton, it takes in the CO2, and when the animal breathes, it slowly releases the CO2 back into the atmosphere. Alternatively, as green plants like phytoplankton die and fall to the ground or sink to the ocean floor, a small fraction of their organic carbon is burned. It remains there for millions of years after taking the form of substances like oil, coal, and shale.
There have been some criticisms of ocean iron fertilization raised within the scientific community. The three main concerns that critics have are the effectiveness of the process, the feasibility of implementing the method, and the negative ecological effects of large algal blooms. The first concern we will discuss is the effectiveness of ocean iron fertilization. The initial laboratory tests of iron fertilization predicted that for every ton of iron added into the ocean, it could remove up to 30,000 to 110,000 tons of carbon from the atmosphere. Small-scale tests of iron fertilization have yielded results much lower than that, with some tests being uncertain if any significant amount of carbon was sequestered at all. This suggests that iron fertilization would need to be implemented on a very large scale to make a significant impact, something that we will address with the feasibility concern. To produce significant results, we will need to fertilize large areas of the ocean, and we would require massive amounts of iron. A 2002 experiment, the Southern Ocean Iron Experiment, determined that a 15 square kilometer area laced with iron was only able to remove 900 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. 900 tons is only a small fraction of our annual carbon emissions, and scaling ocean iron fertilization up to make a significant impact on carbon sequestration seems to be impractical. The final and most important criticism of ocean iron fertilization is the negative ecological impacts that could come with the large algal blooms. As explained earlier, ocean iron fertilization relies on the algal blooms to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and sink to the bottom of the ocean. However, bacteria that feed on the sinking algal detritus also consume oxygen, which could make the deep ocean anoxic. Algal blooms also consume nutrients in the ocean such as nitrates, so areas surrounding iron fertilization sites would see a drop in nutrient levels. The upset of balance of nutrients in the water would have a negative impact all the way up the marine food chain. In summary, ocean iron fertilization is a geoengineering technique that is supposed to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and enhance the ocean as a carbon sink. The addition of iron spawns algal blooms which through photosynthesis absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. In theory, ocean iron fertilization has a lot of potential to help mitigate climate change. However, before we start dumping massive amounts of iron into the ocean, we need to conduct larger scale tests and study further the impacts on marine ecosystems when large amounts of iron are introduced. This concludes our presentation on ocean iron fertilization. We hope you enjoyed, and thanks for tuning in.